Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm yet extraordinary journey into the life of Yuri Gagarin, the first human ever to leave our planet and look back at Earth from the silence of space. Imagine being the very first to see the blue sphere of our home rising beneath you, floating in darkness, shining with clouds and oceans. This story is about courage, history, and the quiet steps that led one man to change forever the way humanity sees itself. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. In the early morning of March 9th, 1934, in the small village of Klushino, west of Moscow, a boy was born who would one day carry the hopes of an entire nation beyond the sky. His family lived a modest life. His father, Alexey Ivanovich, worked as a carpenter, and his mother, Anna Timofeyevna, cared for the children and the household. The Soviet countryside in the 1930s was poor but strong, rooted in tradition, with wooden homes, simple tools, and long days of labour. Yuri was the third of 4 children, surrounded by brothers and sisters who shared both the struggles and joys of rural life. The village itself had little to offer beyond open fields, a few barns, and the rhythm of nature. But for a curious child, it was a world full of discovery. His early years were marked by the shadow of war. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Klushino felt the shock of occupation. The Gagarin family's home was taken by German soldiers, forcing them to build a small hut out of clay behind the barn. These were cold, hungry times, yet they built resilience into Yuri's character. As a boy, he learned what it meant to survive hardship, and this sense of endurance would later define him as a man. Even in those difficult years, Yuri's natural curiosity never dimmed. He loved to look at the sky, watching the clouds drift and the stars appear at night. He was fascinated by machines, by how things worked, and he helped his father repair tools and build simple devices. That early connection between hands, heart, and mind gave him a confidence that stayed with him throughout his life. After the war ended, schools reopened, and Yuri began to study seriously. Teachers noticed his quick mind and strong discipline. He wasn't the tallest or the strongest boy, but he had a quiet determination and a calm way of leading others. His classmates often said he carried a sense of optimism, even when times were harsh. He loved mathematics and physics, and these subjects opened a window to a bigger world than the one he knew in Klushino. At 14, his family moved to Gzhatsk, a nearby town with more opportunities. There, Yuri enrolled in vocational training and began to show a special interest in metalwork and engineering. He worked hard at a foundry, learning the patience and precision needed to mould and shape metal. It was hot, tiring work, but it gave him strength and taught him the value of effort. He soon joined a local flying club, and this changed everything. The first time he saw a small plane up close, he felt something stir inside him. He began training in gliders, learning to control the fragile craft in silence above the fields. His instructors were impressed by his calmness, his ability to concentrate, and his natural feel for flight. For Yuri, the sky became a second home. The simplicity of soaring, the freedom of the air, was unlike anything he had known before. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union was rebuilding itself from the ruins of war, and young men like Yuri were called to contribute to the nation's progress. He entered technical school in Saratov, where he balanced his studies with flying lessons. His days were full, yet he never seemed to lose energy. Friends remembered his cheerful smile, his humility, and his willingness to help others. He wasn't driven by ambition alone, he was driven by a sense of purpose. It was during these years that Yuri began to dream of becoming a pilot, not just for the excitement, but for the idea that flying was a way to push beyond limits. Aviation in the Soviet Union carried both prestige and risk, and only the best could succeed. Yuri knew he was still a long way from the cockpit of a fighter jet, but each hour in the air, each lesson in patience, discipline, and courage was shaping the man he was to become. When he graduated in 1951, he applied to the Orenburg Pilot School, one of the most important steps in his journey. At first, he struggled with landings. His short stature made it difficult to see over the cockpit controls, and his instructors worried he might not succeed. But Yuri refused to give up. He practiced tirelessly, repeating landings until he mastered them with precision. This persistence would later convince others that he was not only skilled, but also deeply committed. By the time he earned his pilot's wings, he had proven that determination could overcome obstacles of size, fear, and doubt. He had become a pilot, and though he did not yet know it, destiny was pulling him toward the stars. After receiving his wings, Yuri Gagarin was assigned to fly MiG fighter jets, the pride of Soviet aviation. The transition from small training planes to powerful military machines was dramatic, but Yuri adapted with remarkable speed. Though he remained shorter than many of his peers, he compensated with discipline, patience, and flawless focus. His instructors saw in him not only skill, but also a rare calmness, a quality that could turn danger into manageable challenge. Pilots of his unit often remembered his ever-present smile, a quiet energy that lifted morale even in demanding situations. Gagarin was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his sincerity left an impression. In 1955, at the Orenburg Aviation School, he met Valentina Ivanovna Goryacheva, a young woman training as a nurse. Their paths crossed almost by chance, yet something about her presence struck him deeply. She admired his resilience and kind nature, while he valued her warmth and intelligence. They married in 1957, and together they began a modest life, filled with the hopes and uncertainties of a young couple. It was the same year the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. For Gagarin, already captivated by the skies, this event widened the horizon of possibility. Suddenly, the dream of leaving Earth was no longer confined to science fiction. It was real, and it was happening within his lifetime. In those years, the Soviet government secretly began forming a program to train the first cosmonauts. The task was immense: to find individuals with perfect health, strong psychological endurance, and the courage to face the unknown. Selection was ruthless. Out of thousands of applicants, only a small group of pilots would be chosen. Yuri applied without hesitation. Despite his height being below the average, it became an advantage, since the capsule of the spacecraft required men of smaller build. Doctors examined every detail of his body, tested his heart under stress, and measured his reaction to isolation and pressure. Where others grew restless, Yuri remained calm. Where others hesitated, he smiled. He had grown up in hardship, and the silence of cramped chambers or the heat of stress chambers did not break his spirit. Soon he was selected as one of the top candidates. Training began with intensity that tested both mind and body. Cosmonauts were spun in giant centrifuges to simulate the crushing force of launch. They were locked in soundless chambers for hours to test their psychological stability. They dove into freezing water in full suits, learned how to survive in forests in case of emergency landings, and practiced controlling spacecraft simulators with precision. Yuri thrived under this regime. He treated challenges as puzzles to be solved rather than threats to endure. His comrades respected him not only for his performance but also for his empathy. He often encouraged those who struggled, sharing quiet words that lifted them. This combination of strength and kindness began to set him apart. By 1960, the Soviet Union had narrowed the group down to 20 cosmonauts. Among them, Yuri Gagarin stood out. He was not only physically fit, but also carried an approachable humanity, a face and voice that seemed destined to represent more than himself. His smile carried warmth, his eyes reflected determination, and his story, from a boy in a poor village to a trained pilot, resonated with the people. Those who knew him believed that if someone were to become the first human in space, it should be Yuri. The dream of reaching the stars was now close enough to touch. By the spring of 1960, the Soviet space program had become one of the most secretive and ambitious projects in the world. The chosen cosmonauts lived under constant supervision, trained daily, and faced an endless series of examinations. For Yuri, the rhythm of training was exhausting yet deeply fulfilling. He knew that history was being written, and each test brought him one step closer to the stars. His days began early, often with physical drills that strengthened endurance. Running, swimming, and long hours of exercise were followed by classroom lessons in orbital mechanics and spacecraft engineering. The cosmonauts had to understand not just how to survive a mission, but how the very machines they would ride into space worked. Yuri listened attentively, asked questions when necessary, and absorbed knowledge with quiet focus. Many of his instructors admired his humility. He never claimed to know more than he did, yet he learned quickly. Beyond the physical strain, psychological resilience was essential. The men were placed in small isolation chambers, sometimes for 10 days or longer, to test how they managed complete solitude. For many, the silence was overwhelming. Some grew anxious, counting the seconds until release. Yuri, however, found calm within the stillness. He would recall the fields of his childhood, the sound of wind moving through crops, or the voices of his family. These memories became companions, keeping his spirit steady. Such qualities made his name rise higher on the list of candidates. In March 1960, tragedy struck the program when a rocket exploded on the launch pad during testing, killing many engineers and technicians. The cosmonauts understood the risk more vividly than ever. They were reminded that space travel was not just an adventure, it was dangerous, uncharted territory. Yet Yuri did not flinch. He accepted the reality with quiet resolve, believing that progress required courage. Among his fellow cosmonauts, camaraderie grew strong. They were competitors, but also brothers, bound by the knowledge that only one of them might be chosen for the first flight. Yuri's closest friendship was with German Titov, another talented pilot. They often trained side by side, encouraging each other, yet neither let rivalry darken their respect. The final decision about who would fly first rested with the highest levels of Soviet leadership, including Sergei Korolev, the chief designer. Korolev was impressed by Yuri's technical skills, his calm under pressure, and his ability to remain optimistic no matter the circumstance. But there was also something else. Yuri's personality reflected the qualities the Soviet Union wanted to show the world: strength, simplicity, and humanity. As 1961 approached, whispers spread through the training center. The first mission, named Vostok 1, was nearly ready. The spacecraft was small, cramped, and filled with instruments, but it represented a doorway to the cosmos. Only one man would sit inside it for the first human flight. Though none of the cosmonauts were told directly, many began to suspect that Yuri Gagarin would be the one. By early April 1961, the secret was confirmed. Yuri Gagarin had been chosen to make the first flight into space. Officially, the decision was presented as the result of rigorous evaluation. His health, his performance in training, and his calm responses to stress. Unofficially, many believed his genuine smile, his humble background, and his ability to represent the Soviet people also played a decisive role. He embodied not just a pilot, but a symbol. Still, Yuri himself never spoke of competition. To his comrades, he remained modest, often downplaying his achievements and reminding them that each man in the program shared the same risks. When told he would likely be the first, he responded with quiet gratitude, not pride. For him, the honor was as heavy as it was bright. The spacecraft he would command, Vostok 1, was a small spherical capsule. Barely more than 2 meters in diameter, it contained life support systems, instruments, and a single seat. There were no windows large enough for comfort, only small viewports, and every surface was crowded with switches. The cosmonaut would wear a pressure suit, helmet, and remain strapped in for the entire mission. It was not a comfortable vehicle, but it was enough to carry a human beyond the atmosphere. In the days leading to launch, Yuri underwent final preparations. Doctors examined him repeatedly, checking heart, lungs, blood pressure. Engineers briefed him on every procedure. He rehearsed emergency scenarios again and again, from parachute landings to capsule malfunctions. Each night, he wrote short notes to his wife Valentina, assuring her of his confidence, even though he knew the risks were immense. On April 11, 1961, Yuri and his backup, German Titov, were flown to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. The vast steppe stretched endlessly, flat and silent, broken only by launch towers rising into the sky. At night, the desert grew cold, stars shining with piercing clarity. Yuri walked among the shadows of the rockets, reflecting on how far his journey had carried him, from a clay hut in Klushino to the edge of space. His final night before launch was calm. He shared a quiet meal with his fellow cosmonauts and officials. They spoke softly, as though words might disturb the fragile moment. Yuri smiled often, lifting the spirits of those around him, yet within himself he carried a weight of history. Tomorrow he would not only fly for his country, but for all humanity. The morning of April 12, 1961 arrived with a pale glow over the Kazakh steppe. At Baikonur, engineers and soldiers moved quietly around the towering R-7 rocket, their breath visible in the cold air. The rocket itself, immense and metallic, stood like a spear pointed at the sky. Inside its upper stage waited the small capsule, Vostok 1, prepared for the most daring journey in human history. Yuri Gagarin woke early. He dressed in a white medical suit and underwent his last physical check. His blood pressure was measured, his heartbeat monitored. Everything showed normal, though those who knew him suspected that even if fear had touched him, he would never let it show. He greeted the doctors with a cheerful nod and smiled at his handlers, radiating calm. Before departure, he was allowed to speak briefly with Valentina by phone. Their words were few, careful, but heavy with meaning. He reassured her, promising he would return. She reminded him to stay safe, though both knew safety could not be guaranteed. Afterward, Yuri was taken to a bus that carried him toward the launch pad. The ride was short, but in those minutes he looked out across the vast steppe, reflecting silently. For all its emptiness, the land seemed full of echoes, ancestors, labourers, soldiers, every life that had built the foundation for this moment. At the pad, technicians helped him into his orange pressure suit, securing the helmet and gloves. Each strap, each buckle was checked twice. His oxygen supply was tested, communication lines connected. The suit felt heavy, but it also carried a strange comfort. It was his armour against the unknown. When the preparations were complete, Yuri climbed into the capsule. The seat was narrow, moulded to his body. Panels crowded with switches surrounded him. He reported calmly to ground control, his voice steady. Above him, layers of rocket fuel groaned and hissed as pumps worked to feed the engines. Outside, officials gave final salutes. Loudspeakers echoed across the field. Soon, ignition would shake the earth. Lying inside, Yuri thought not of politics or power, but of the journey itself, the first human rising into space. Moments later, the countdown began. The countdown echoed across the steppe, a slow, steady rhythm marking the seconds to history. Engineers held their breath. Officials stood motionless, and within the capsule, Yuri Gagarin listened quietly, his hands resting near the controls. At the final moment, the engines roared to life. The ground trembled, smoke and fire poured from beneath the rocket, and the immense machine began to rise. "Poyakali! Let's go!" Yuri exclaimed, his voice filled with energy. It was a simple word, yet it became immortal. The rocket lifted higher, breaking free from the launch pad, climbing into the morning sky. Inside, Yuri felt the crushing weight of acceleration press against his body. The G-forces were immense, yet his training prepared him. His pulse raced, but he remained steady, reporting calmly to ground control. Below him, the Kazakh desert shrank rapidly, then disappeared beneath clouds. Within minutes, the blue of the atmosphere grew thinner, fading into the darkness of space. For the first time in human history, a man had left Earth. Silence surrounded him. broken only by the hum of instruments. Through a small porthole, Yuri glimpsed the curve of the planet below. Oceans shimmered with light, clouds drifted across continents, and the Earth glowed against the black void. It was breathtaking, unlike anything described in books or dreams. He later said it was impossible not to be captivated by the sight, a fragile sphere floating alone in vast darkness. The flight lasted 108 minutes, one orbit around Earth. As the capsule travelled at thousands of miles per hour, Yuri monitored instruments, adjusted systems, and communicated with control centres. He described the view calmly, noting the colours of land, the shadows of mountains, and the thin line of atmosphere that separated life from emptiness. While the world below continued its routines, no one there yet fully realised that humanity's perspective had forever changed. Yet the journey was not without risk. As the capsule approached the end of its orbit, preparations for re-entry began. Heat shields would need to withstand fiery descent, parachutes would need to open at the precise moment. Any failure could mean disaster. Alone in the capsule, Yuri trusted both his training and the engineers who had built this vessel. As the spacecraft began its return, he braced himself for the final trial of his mission. As Vostok 1 began re-entry, Yuri Gagarin prepared for the most dangerous part of his flight. The capsule, still travelling at incredible speed, slammed into the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere. Friction turned air into fire, surrounding the small sphere with flames. Inside, Yuri felt the crushing force return, his body pressed tightly into the seat. The capsule shook violently, alarms flickered, and for a few moments communication broke. On the ground, engineers listened in tense silence, unsure if their cosmonaut had survived the first barrier. But Yuri remained calm, his breathing steady, his focus absolute. Slowly the capsule stabilized, flames fading as it slowed. Yet one final challenge awaited: ejection. The Vostok capsule was not designed for a soft landing. Instead, once it descended to a lower altitude, Yuri was to eject with his parachute. At about 7 kilometers above the ground, the hatch opened, and he was propelled into the open air. For a moment, silence returned, replaced quickly by the rush of wind. His parachute deployed perfectly, blossoming against the sky. Below him stretched fields near the Volga River, peaceful and quiet after the chaos of space. Villagers working nearby looked up in astonishment at the sight of a man drifting down from the heavens in a bright orange suit. As he landed safely, farmers and a young girl approached cautiously, unsure of who or what they were seeing. Yuri reassured them with a smile and simple words. He was a Soviet, returning from space. News of his success spread instantly, racing across radio waves. By evening, the entire world knew a human had travelled into space and returned alive. Crowds filled streets in Moscow, London, Paris, New York, cheering the accomplishment. In every language, the name Yuri Gagarin was spoken with awe. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph, proof that their space program had surpassed all others. For humanity, it was a moment of unity, a shared step into the unknown. When officials reached the landing site, they escorted Yuri back to base, where doctors once again checked every detail of his health. He was tired but uninjured, still smiling, still humble. He thanked the engineers, the scientists and his comrades, reminding everyone that it was a collective effort. Yet deep down, he must have felt the weight of what he had seen. The Earth from above, fragile and beautiful, glowing against the infinite black. That image would remain with him forever. When Yuri Gagarin returned to Moscow after his historic flight, the city erupted in celebration. Crowds filled every street, waving flags, singing and cheering as his motorcade moved slowly through the capital. People leaned out of windows, children climbed trees, and soldiers saluted proudly. For a nation that had endured war, hardship, and immense rebuilding, this moment felt like a gift, a sign that sacrifice had meaning, that progress was real. Yuri stood in an open car, smiling and waving. his youthful face shining with both pride and humility. He had become more than a pilot. He was now a symbol of human possibility. The Soviet leadership quickly realized the power of his image. They presented him not only as a hero of the state, but also as a representative of all humanity. Newspapers published his story in every detail, and photographs of his flight suit and capsule spread worldwide. In Western capitals, leaders acknowledged his achievement with both respect and concern, for the space race was as political as it was scientific. Yet beyond rivalry, ordinary people across the globe felt awe. For the first time, someone had looked down at Earth and described it as small, fragile, and beautiful. Yuri's words, spoken with sincerity, resonated everywhere. Soon after, he embarked on a tour that would carry him far beyond the Soviet Union. He travelled to countries across Europe, Asia, and even Latin America, welcomed as a guest of honour. In each place, crowds greeted him warmly. Children handed him flowers, workers cheered, and heads of state shook his hand. Wherever he went, people were struck by his simplicity. Despite his sudden fame, he remained approachable, often laughing, answering questions with patience, and showing genuine interest in those he met. For many, he became not just a Soviet hero, but a global ambassador of peace. Still, back at home, his life changed dramatically. He could no longer fly regular missions as before. Officials feared losing their national treasure in an accident. Instead, he worked closely with the space program, contributing to training and development for future missions. Though proud of his role, he sometimes longed for the sky, missing the freedom of flight. In private moments, he returned to his family, where Valentina and their 2 young daughters gave him grounding and joy. The world outside may have seen a legend, but at home he remained simply a husband and father. Even so, every step he took carried the weight of history. As the months passed after his historic flight, Yuri Gagarin's life entered a new phase, one filled with both honour and responsibility. He became an international figure, the face of a new era in human history. Invitations poured in from governments, universities, and organisations eager to meet the first man in space. Each trip became a spectacle. Airports overflowing with people, processions through crowded streets, banquets held in grand halls. Though ceremonies were overwhelming, Yuri remained gracious, always smiling, always carrying himself with calm dignity. Behind the public image, however, he carried a quieter burden. He knew that his flight had not been without danger. Technical malfunctions, violent re-entry, the risky ejection, these had nearly ended his mission in disaster. Few outside the program knew how narrow his margin of survival had been. To Yuri, this truth only deepened his respect for the engineers and technicians who made the impossible possible. He often reminded audiences that the triumph belonged not to him alone, but to the countless workers who built the rockets, calculated trajectories, and ensured every detail was correct. At home in the Soviet Union, his fame grew to extraordinary levels. Monuments were erected, songs written in his honour, and schoolchildren were taught to look to him as a model of courage. For ordinary people who had endured poverty and war, Yuri's flight was a source of deep pride. It showed that someone from humble beginnings, a carpenter's son from Klushino, could rise higher than anyone had before, literally beyond the sky. Despite the celebrations, Yuri sought to return to work with the Cosmonaut Corps. He missed flying and training, the daily rhythm of preparing for missions, yet the authorities restricted him, fearing for his safety. The loss of such a symbol would have been unthinkable. This protective barrier frustrated him at times, but he accepted it with patience, channeling his energy into mentoring new cosmonauts. He became a senior figure within the program, guiding younger pilots through grueling tests, offering advice drawn from his own experience. His natural warmth made him approachable, and many trainees saw him not only as a leader, but as a friend. Meanwhile, the space race accelerated. The United States was preparing its own manned flights, and the Soviet Union was determined to maintain its lead. discussions of longer missions, spacecraft capable of maneuvering, and even the dream of reaching the moon filled the air. Yuri was eager to participate in these ventures, yet he knew his role had changed. He had opened the door, but others would now step through. Even so, he remained deeply involved, reviewing designs, advising engineers, and lending his perspective to the next generation of missions. Fame, he discovered, was both a gift and a chain. Wherever he walked, people recognized him. They wanted his handshake, his words, his smile. He gave it freely, but sometimes longed for the quiet fields of his childhood, for the simplicity of flight in a small glider, far from cameras and speeches. Still, he carried his responsibilities with grace, aware that history had chosen him for a unique path. By the early 1960s, Yuri Gagarin had become not only the pride of the Soviet Union, but also a living legend across the world. Yet beneath the honours, parades, and endless ceremonies, he remained a man who loved the air, the feel of flight, and the discipline of the pilot's life. Officials, however, struggled with how to balance his role as a global figure with his desire to return to risk-filled duties. On the one hand, they wanted him protected, too valuable to endanger. On the other, Gagarin himself longed for challenges. He knew that space exploration was only beginning, and he wished to be part of what came next. The next great milestone for the Soviet program was long-duration missions. If a man could orbit Earth once, could he orbit many times? Could he live in space for days, perhaps weeks? These questions shaped the planning of future Vostok and Vostok extended flights. Yuri contributed to the preparations, sharing his insights with engineers and doctors. He explained the psychological pressures of isolation, the physical stress of launch and re-entry, and the critical importance of reliable communication. His calm and precise observations became invaluable to those designing improvements. At the same time, his public duties only grew heavier. He visited factories, schools, and military units, shaking hands with workers and inspiring students. Wherever he went, people listened with respect. He had a gift for making others feel included in his success, telling them that his flight was not just his own, but the result of every hand that had built the nation. Still, moments of weariness came. Valentina noticed it most clearly. At home, away from the ceremonies, Yuri sometimes sat quietly, lost in thought. His daughters brought him joy, but the demands of fame often kept him away. Though he tried to give them time, the pace of his new life was unrelenting. Yet even in private he avoided complaint. Instead, he spoke of the future with hope. The rivalry with the United States sharpened when American astronaut John Glenn completed his own orbital flight in 1962. The competition was no longer just about firsts, but about endurance, distance, and eventually the moon itself. Yuri recognized this shift and knew that if humanity ever reached beyond Earth in a lasting way, it would require patience, cooperation, and courage on a scale greater than before. Within the cosmonaut corps, Yuri remained a mentor. He encouraged others, guided them through difficult training, and offered reassurance when tests became unbearable. Many younger cosmonauts described him as a steadying presence, someone whose calm energy carried them forward. Though he missed the cockpit, he knew his influence reached beyond a single flight. His story had become a foundation for all who followed, a reminder that one step into the unknown could inspire millions. By 1963, Yuri Gagarin's name was carved into the fabric of global history. Yet his own journey was still unfolding. The Soviet Union continued its rapid pace in the space race, and each new mission built upon the foundations he had laid. Yuri, though often sidelined from direct flights, immersed himself in the program as a leader, advisor, and symbol of its spirit. He worked closely with Sergei Korolev, the chief architect of the Soviet space program, whose vision and determination pushed boundaries. Korolev valued Yuri not just as a figurehead, but as a man of insight. Gagarin's feedback on spacecraft design, safety measures, and crew training carried great weight. He spoke not with arrogance, but with quiet clarity. describing what it felt like to trust your life to a machine surrounded by fire and silence. His words reminded engineers that beyond equations and metal, there was a human being inside. During this period, the Soviet Union achieved another milestone. The first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, launched aboard Vostok 6 in June 1963. Yuri took great pride in her accomplishment, supporting her training and later celebrating her success. Together they symbolized the inclusiveness of the new frontier. Space was not just for a chosen few, but for all humanity. Their joint public appearances captured the imagination of millions, showing the face of progress and possibility. Still, Gagarin quietly wished to return to active flight duty. He argued with officials that he should not be sheltered forever, that progress required risks. Though his requests were often denied, he was finally permitted to resume flying regular aircraft to maintain his skills. Returning to the cockpit was like returning to himself. The hum of engines, the feel of controls in his hands, the freedom of the sky, these were elements of his identity that parades could never replace. He flew training jets with discipline, careful to show that his skills remained sharp. Yet there was always caution in the background. Commanders reminded him constantly that he was more than a pilot now. He was a national treasure. Outside of work, Yuri continued to travel widely. He met leaders across continents, sat in parliaments, and addressed universities. In every language, his message was similar, that space belonged to all people, that its exploration should unite rather than divide. He spoke with sincerity, never lecturing, always sharing. His charm and warmth won over even those who saw the Soviet Union as a rival. Children especially adored him. They flocked to him during visits, eager for a handshake or a smile. In those moments, he was not a distant hero, but a kind presence, approachable and genuine. By the mid-1960s, Yuri understood that his life had shifted permanently. He was no longer just a man who had flown once into orbit. He was part of something larger, the story of humanity reaching outward. And though his own desire to return to space remained strong, he accepted his role as both pioneer and guide, carrying with grace the weight of being first. By the middle of the 1960s, the space race had reached a new intensity. Both the Soviet Union and the United States pushed further, not content with short missions, but striving toward the moon. For Yuri Gagarin, who had once been the lone traveller in Earth's orbit, it was extraordinary to watch how quickly the frontier expanded. He felt pride, but also a quiet longing to be part of these new adventures. His official duties, however, kept him grounded. As Deputy Training Director at the Cosmonaut Center, he oversaw younger pilots preparing for missions that would last longer, demand greater precision, and carry heavier risks. Gagarin's experience made him invaluable. He understood the stress of launch, the silence of orbit, and the weight of responsibility that no classroom could teach. Trainees often sought his advice, and he guided them with patience. His presence reassured them that even the unknown could be faced with courage. In 1965, the Soviets achieved another first. Alexei Leonov conducted the world's first spacewalk. Yuri, deeply involved in preparations, watched with fascination as Leonov stepped into the void tethered only by a thin line. The risk was immense, and when complications nearly trapped Leonov outside, Yuri felt the tension with every passing second. When Leonov finally returned safely, Yuri celebrated with genuine joy, proud that another milestone had been crossed. Yet moments like this deepened his yearning to return himself. He often petitioned to be included in new missions, pointing out that his training remained sharp. The leadership, however, continued to shield him. To them, Gagarin was too precious, too symbolic to risk. Though he accepted the decision outwardly, inside he struggled with the frustration of being placed forever on the sidelines. Beyond his professional life, Yuri became increasingly active in politics. He was elected to the Supreme Soviet, where he used his position to advocate for education, science, and the welfare of workers. His speeches were never filled with heavy ideology. Instead, they carried the same sincerity he showed everywhere else. He reminded his listeners that progress in space was connected to progress on Earth, that knowledge and opportunity must serve the people. Despite his fame, Yuri remained approachable. Colleagues noticed that he never distanced himself from ordinary workers. He spoke to technicians with the same respect he offered to ministers, and he often visited factories without ceremony, shaking hands with those who had built the machines that made his flight possible. At home, he cherished moments with his daughters. Though his schedule was relentless, he read to them when he could, played simple games, and shared stories of the stars. To them, he was not a distant hero but a loving father. This balance of global fame and intimate humanity made him unique. By 1966, as the Soviet program faced setbacks with rocket failures and the loss of key missions, Yuri remained a beacon of hope. People looked to him not just for what he had done, but for what he symbolized, that no matter the obstacles, humanity's journey outward had already begun. In 1966, the Soviet space program suffered a great loss with the sudden death of Sergei Korolev, the chief designer who had guided every step of its early successes. For Yuri Gagarin, this was more than the loss of a leader. It was the loss of a mentor and a friend. Korolev had believed in him, defended his place among the cosmonauts, and trusted him with the first flight. Now, without Korolev's steady hand, the program faced uncertainty. Engineers worked tirelessly, but setbacks grew more frequent. Rockets failed to launch, missions ended prematurely, and the competition with the United States intensified. Yuri, though deeply saddened, stepped into a stronger advisory role, offering his experience to keep morale alive. He reminded younger cosmonauts that risk was part of progress, and that even failures carried lessons. His calm voice during meetings steadied others when frustration threatened to overwhelm them. Yet the absence of Korolev weighed heavily on him. For the first time, Yuri felt that the future of the program was not as secure as it once seemed. Despite the difficulties, training continued. Yuri often accompanied new crews to Baikonur, overseeing final preparations. He inspected spacecraft, reviewed emergency procedures, and offered words of encouragement before launch. His presence was a source of comfort, a reminder that someone who had faced the unknown and returned was standing beside them. Still, his own desire to return to space remained strong. He knew officials hesitated, fearing that another mission might endanger the nation's most celebrated figure. But Yuri's arguments grew persistent. He believed that leadership came not only from words but from action, and he wanted to prove again that he was more than a symbol. At home, his life was equally complex. Fame continued to follow him everywhere. Crowds still gathered, children still shouted his name. But Yuri longed for quieter moments. He spent time with Valentina and their daughters whenever possible, walking with them in parks, teaching them to swim, or sharing evenings at home. His family remained his anchor, a space where he could simply be himself, free from the constant weight of history. Yet the strain of his schedule showed. Travel, public duties, and political responsibilities consumed much of his energy. Friends recalled that though he smiled often, there were moments when his eyes betrayed fatigue. He carried the expectations of a nation, and that responsibility never left him. Internationally, his influence remained strong. He visited countries in Africa and Asia, where emerging nations looked to space exploration as a symbol of modern progress. Yuri's words carried encouragement, reminding them that the stars belong to all people, not just to powerful nations. By the end of 1966, the Soviet program was preparing for new milestones: multi-crew flights, docking maneuvers, and the eventual dream of lunar exploration. Yuri's role in these projects was vital, even if he was not chosen to fly. He had become both guide and guardian of the next steps, determined that the path Korolev had begun would continue forward, no matter the obstacles. By 1967, the Soviet Union prepared for one of its most ambitious missions. Soyuz, a new generation of spacecraft designed to carry crews, perform complex maneuvers, and eventually support lunar flights. The program symbolized the next great leap forward, but it also carried immense risks. Engineers worked under pressure, rushing to meet deadlines, while politicians demanded successes that would keep the Soviet lead in the space race. Yuri Gagarin, though not selected as the prime pilot, was assigned as backup for the first Soyuz mission. For him, it was both an honor and a torment. He longed to return to space, yet he also knew the dangers of an untested craft. He threw himself into preparations, training alongside Vladimir Komarov, the man chosen for the flight. The two shared a strong bond, built on respect and the shared knowledge of what it meant to carry history on their shoulders. As April 1967 approached, engineers voiced concerns about Soyuz 1. The spacecraft still had technical issues, systems that failed tests, and equipment not fully reliable. Some argued that the mission should be delayed, but pressure from the top demanded it move forward. Yuri quietly shared his worries with close colleagues. He trusted Komarov's skill, but feared the machine would not protect him. On launch day, Yuri stood at Baikonur, watching his friend climb aboard. He offered words of encouragement, though his heart was heavy. When the rocket lifted, it carried not only Komarov but the hopes of the entire program. Within hours, problems began. Solar panels failed to deploy, power systems weakened, controls malfunctioned. Komarov fought bravely, reporting each issue, improvising solutions where he could. On the ground, Yuri and others listened anxiously, powerless to intervene. After a day in orbit, the decision was made to bring Soyuz 1 back. As it re-entered the atmosphere, a new disaster struck. The parachutes failed. The spacecraft plummeted, crashing into the Earth. Komarov was killed instantly. News of his death shook the program to its core. For Yuri, it was a personal tragedy. He had not only lost a comrade, but a friend he deeply admired. Standing at the crash site later, he felt both sorrow and anger. Sorrow for the man, anger at the haste that had cost him his life. In the days that followed, Yuri spoke at memorials, his voice calm but his grief evident. He reminded those present that Komarov's sacrifice must never be forgotten, that every lesson learned must ensure future safety. His words carried weight, but privately he carried the memory heavily. The loss reinforced his belief that space exploration was as fragile as it was glorious, and that courage often came with unbearable cost. The death of Vladimir Komarov left a deep scar on the Soviet space program, and for Yuri Gagarin, it was a wound that did not heal quickly. In public, he remained composed, speaking of Komarov's bravery and honouring his legacy. But in private, friends noticed his mood darken. He had always carried an optimistic spirit, a steady smile that reassured those around him. After Komarov's loss, however, there were moments of silence in his presence, as if his thoughts drifted back again and again to that fiery crash. He understood more clearly than anyone that he too could have been in that seat. As backup pilot, his fate had rested on the thinnest of margins. This realization made him both grateful and restless. He wanted to ensure that no other cosmonaut would be lost to preventable flaws. In meetings, Yuri began to speak with unusual force. He argued for stricter testing, for slower schedules, for the voices of engineers to be heard over political demands. Some officials were uneasy with his frankness, but few dared to challenge him. His authority as the first man in space gave him weight, and his sincerity was undeniable. Still, bureaucracy moved slowly, and Yuri often left such sessions frustrated. Despite the grief, he did not retreat from duty. He continued his role as deputy training director, mentoring new cosmonauts. Many of them, still young and untested, looked to him as a guardian figure. He guided them through survival training in forests, through punishing hours in centrifuges, through long days in simulators. When fear rose, he reminded them calmly that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving forward despite it. Outside of the program, Yuri sought balance in his family. His daughters, growing older, brought him both joy and distraction from the heavy weight of his responsibilities. He spent time with them whenever he could, teaching them small lessons, encouraging their curiosity, and reminding them that even the greatest journeys begin with small steps. His wife Valentina provided quiet strength, understanding the burdens he carried, though she too worried for his safety. As the space race pressed on, Yuri's name remained powerful internationally. He continued to travel abroad, welcomed as a hero not only for his flight but for his humanity. In speeches, he spoke less of rivalry and more of unity, urging that exploration beyond Earth should be a task for all nations, not a contest that divided them. His sincerity touched audiences, even those in countries far from the Soviet Union. Yet at home, whispers grew louder. Yuri wanted to fly again. Despite the risks, despite Komarov's fate, his longing for space never faded. He argued that his skills were sharp, his health strong, his training complete. He believed that his role was not finished, that he was more than a symbol, he was still a cosmonaut. For those around him, this desire was both inspiring and unsettling, for they knew that if anyone deserved another flight, it was Yuri. But they also knew what another failure could mean. By 1968, Yuri Gagarin had regained much of the confidence and energy that grief had once dimmed. Though Komarov's death still lingered in his thoughts, Yuri threw himself into training, determined to prove that he remained fit for duty. He resumed flying jets regularly, practicing maneuvers with the same precision that had defined his early career. His instructors and comrades noted that despite years of public life, Yuri's skill in the cockpit had not diminished. If anything, his maturity had given him sharper judgment, a balance between daring and caution. Yet those in authority continued to debate whether he should ever be allowed back into space. To lose the first man who had flown beyond Earth would have been a symbolic blow too heavy for the nation to bear. Still, Yuri pressed his case, reminding leaders that he had trained for years, that his knowledge was fresh, and that he could contribute not just as an advisor, but as an active cosmonaut. His arguments carried weight, but decisions moved slowly. While waiting, he immersed himself in work at the Cosmonaut Training Center. He supervised simulation exercises for the new Soyuz spacecraft, advised on safety protocols, and pushed for higher standards in testing. He believed that Komarov's tragedy demanded change, that no mission should launch unless every possible failure had been examined. His words were sometimes unwelcome in a system driven by deadlines, but his authority as a national hero protected him. Beyond his official role, Yuri began writing about his experiences. He worked with editors to publish accounts of his flight, his training, and his reflections on space. These writings, while carefully reviewed by censors, carried a quiet poetry. He described Earth as a fragile sphere, wrapped in the thinnest veil of atmosphere, shining like a jewel against the void. His words touched readers deeply, reminding them that beyond politics, space revealed something universal about humanity's place in the cosmos. At home, life remained a balance of public duties and private joys. His daughters, older now, were beginning to understand who their father was to the world, though to them he was still simply Papa. Yuri treasured evenings with them, listening to their questions, encouraging their dreams. He hoped that their generation would inherit a world where space was not a battlefield of nations but a shared horizon. Yet despite the warmth of family and the respect he received globally, Yuri's longing to fly again never left him. It was not ambition alone, it was identity. Flying had shaped him since boyhood, and space remained the summit of that calling. In quiet conversations with trusted friends, he admitted that until he returned to the sky, a part of him would always feel unfinished. In early 1968, Yuri Gagarin was gradually being reintegrated into more active flight duties. After years of being shielded from risk, the authorities finally allowed him to resume serious training flights with military aircraft. This was not spaceflight, but for Yuri, it was a return to something essential. The cockpit had always been his sanctuary, a place where fame and politics dissolved into the pure focus of flight. Colleagues who trained with him noted his enthusiasm. He performed takeoffs and landings with precision, executed maneuvers smoothly, and showed the same steady calm that had defined his days as a young cadet. To many, it seemed as though he had lost none of his skill. Behind this regained freedom, however, was a compromise. Officials remained unwilling to risk him in space, but they recognized that denying him all flying would erode both his morale and his credibility as a cosmonaut. Allowing him to return to jets was a way of balancing his safety with his dignity. Yuri accepted it with gratitude, though inside his longing for space remained. At the Cosmonaut Training Center, he continued to guide new generations. Younger recruits admired him not only for his history but for his humility. Despite being the most famous cosmonaut of them all, he treated trainees as equals, eating alongside them, listening to their concerns, and sharing stories of his early struggles. He reminded them that skill was built from mistakes, and that persistence mattered more than perfection. His warmth earned him deep loyalty. Politically, Yuri's role also grew. He became a deputy in the Supreme Soviet, representing not just the space program, but the broader vision of progress. His speeches were simple but sincere. He spoke of education, of science, of the need for international cooperation. Audiences responded not to lofty ideology, but to the authenticity of a man who had seen Earth from above and knew its fragility. Internationally, his presence remained powerful. Invitations continued to arrive, though he accepted fewer than in earlier years. When he did travel, his message was consistent, that humanity's future lay beyond borders, in the shared exploration of space. For many outside the Soviet Union, he was more than a symbol of one nation. He was a reminder of what humanity could achieve together. Yet despite the respect, the honours, the responsibilities, Yuri's private desires never changed. He often spoke quietly with close friends about his dream of flying again into space. He knew the risks better than anyone, but he also knew that his destiny felt unfinished. Being first was an honour, but it was also a beginning, not an ending. For Yuri Gagarin, the sky remained a calling, and until he answered it once more, he would never feel complete. By the spring of 1968, Yuri Gagarin stood at a crossroads in his career. He had returned to flying aircraft regularly, yet his ambitions reached further. He wanted to qualify again as an active cosmonaut, to prove that he was not only a figurehead, but still capable of future space missions. His health remained excellent, his reflexes sharp, and his dedication as strong as ever. Many within the Corps supported his request, believing that if anyone deserved another flight, it was the man who had opened the door to space. Yet senior officials hesitated. The memory of Komarov's death and the constant fear of losing their greatest symbol weighed heavily. For them, allowing Gagarin back into space was not only a question of risk, but of national image. Losing him would have been a tragedy felt across the entire world. Still, Yuri persisted. He participated in advanced training sessions, attended engineering briefings, and kept himself in peak condition. Those around him noticed his renewed sense of purpose. It was as though he knew time was precious and that each step mattered. At the same time, he continued to serve as deputy training director, overseeing preparations for Soyuz missions. He inspected simulators, checked survival drills, and guided younger cosmonauts through the grueling process of becoming space-ready. To them, his presence was more than inspiring. It was grounding. Here was a man who had seen Earth from above, who had faced the silence of orbit, reminding them that their struggles were steps towards something extraordinary. Privately, Yuri's longing for flight was balanced by his devotion to family. His daughters, now old enough to understand his place in history, often asked him about space. He spoke gently, describing the Earth's beauty, the thin blue line of atmosphere, the way stars shone brighter beyond the air. He wanted them to feel the wonder without the fear. Valentina, his wife, remained both supportive and cautious. She knew his passion for flying was inseparable from who he was, yet she feared the dangers that came with it. In those years, Yuri's public appearances grew less frequent, though his fame never dimmed. When he did speak abroad, he continued to emphasize unity over rivalry. He often told audiences that from space, borders disappeared, that Earth revealed itself as one whole, fragile and shared. These words carried special weight during a time of global tension. By 1968, the dream of reaching the moon was growing. The Americans were making rapid progress with Apollo, and the Soviets were determined not to fall behind. Yuri wanted to be part of that struggle, to play a direct role rather than simply watch. His determination was clear to those closest to him. He was ready to risk everything again for the chance to reach higher. In March 1968, Yuri Gagarin was deeply engaged in flight training at the Chkalovsky airfield near Moscow. To the outside world, he remained the smiling hero, the first man in space. But within the airfield, he was simply a pilot again, focused on maneuvers, checklists, and the sharp discipline of aviation. He trained on the MiG-15 UTI, a jet used for advanced practice, alongside his instructor Vladimir Seryogin, an experienced officer and decorated flyer. The flights were meant to keep Yuri in top condition, to prove his skills and readiness should he be cleared for future missions. Those who saw him at this time noted how alive he seemed when climbing into the cockpit. The weight of public duties fell away, replaced by the concentration of flight. On the ground, he remained warm and approachable, but in the air he was once again the calm professional who had once tamed the unknown beyond Earth. Yet the program around him was in turmoil. The Soviet lunar project was struggling with technical difficulties, rockets failing, and deadlines slipping. Inside the cosmonaut corps, doubts grew about whether they could truly beat the Americans to the moon. Yuri followed developments closely, often meeting with engineers, reviewing reports, and lending his opinion. His advice carried weight, for he had faced risks firsthand and understood what failure could mean. He urged patience, testing, and above all, the protection of crews. Though some in leadership viewed him as cautious, others respected his insistence on safety. In private, he still dreamed of the moon. He admitted to close friends that to step onto another world would be the greatest honour of all, but he also knew the path ahead was dangerous and uncertain. At home, he sought balance. His daughters filled his evenings with laughter and questions. They wanted to know what stars looked like beyond the atmosphere, whether the Earth really glowed blue. He answered gently, describing what he had seen, never embellishing, always speaking with the quiet wonder that had stayed with him since that first orbit. His family gave him comfort, even as his duties pulled him constantly away. Politically, his position in the Supreme Soviet continued, though Yuri never allowed ambition to outweigh sincerity. He spoke not as a politician, but as a man who had carried the hopes of millions. His words were simple. Space was for all humanity, and the future depended on cooperation. By the time March reached its end, Yuri was busier than ever, balancing flights, responsibilities, and dreams. Few around him could have guessed how swiftly fate would change the course of his story. On the morning of March 27, 1968, Yuri Gagarin arrived at the Chkalovsky airfield prepared for another training flight. The day was cool, the sky veiled with scattered clouds, and the ground crew moved briskly through their routines. Yuri and his instructor, Vladimir Seryogin, were scheduled to fly a MiG-15 UTI, a sturdy jet trainer that both men knew well. It was to be a standard session, nothing unusual, aimed at maintaining Yuri's readiness. As they walked toward the aircraft, witnesses remembered Yuri smiling, speaking casually with technicians. He checked the plane carefully, as was his habit, inspecting controls and reviewing details before boarding. At 10:19 a.m., the jet lifted smoothly from the runway, climbing into the overcast sky. Radio communications confirmed everything was normal. The two men executed maneuvers at altitude, standard practice to sharpen reaction and coordination. For about 20 minutes, the flight proceeded without incident. Then, unexpectedly, ground control lost contact. Reports later suggested that the plane had entered a rapid descent from high altitude. Whether due to turbulence, a sudden maneuver, or external interference, the jet plunged at tremendous speed. At 10:31 a.m., it crashed in the forest near the village of Novosilovo, exploding on impact. Both Gagarin and Seryogin were killed instantly. The news reached Moscow quickly but was held under secrecy until confirmed. When the announcement came, it shocked not only the Soviet Union but the entire world. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, the smiling face of humanity's greatest step, was gone at just 34 years old. Mourning spread rapidly. In Moscow, thousands gathered in silence, carrying flowers, portraits, and candles. Across the globe, leaders expressed sorrow, and ordinary people wept as though they had lost someone close. For many, Yuri was not just a Soviet hero, but a symbol of hope, courage, and the shared dream of exploring beyond Earth. His funeral was held with full honours, his ashes placed in the Kremlin wall, alongside the greatest figures of the nation. Yet grief could not erase the light of his achievement. In just one orbit, he had changed forever the way humanity saw itself. His life, though short, carried a message that endured beyond his years, that courage could lift humanity above fear, and that a single step into the unknown could inspire generations. For the Soviet Union, his loss was immeasurable. For the world, his memory became eternal, bound to the stars he once touched. The death of Yuri Gagarin sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union and the wider world. News of the accident spread quickly, and almost instantly disbelief turned to grief. For millions, it felt impossible that a man so young, so full of life, and so symbolic of humanity's progress could be gone. In Moscow, crowds poured into the streets, some silent, others openly weeping. Workers carried flowers, students held portraits of the smiling cosmonaut, and veterans saluted solemnly. The state declared a period of mourning, and newspapers printed black-bordered tributes. Gagarin's ashes were placed with great ceremony in the Kremlin wall, the sacred resting place of national heroes. The memorial service was attended by leaders, fellow cosmonauts, soldiers, and ordinary citizens. The atmosphere was heavy, yet within it was a profound sense of unity. For one brief moment, grief bound together people of every background, reminding them of the shared pride he had brought. Beyond the Soviet Union, the reaction was no less heartfelt. Messages of condolence arrived from presidents, kings, and prime ministers. In the United States, where the space race had fueled rivalry, astronauts spoke with genuine sorrow. Many admitted that they had admired Gagarin not just as a competitor, but as a pioneer who had shown what was possible. Around the world, monuments were planned, schools and streets renamed, and countless children grew up hearing the story of the first man in space who had looked down on Earth with wonder. For the cosmonaut corps, the loss was deeply personal. Many of them had trained with him, flown beside him, or received his guidance. They remembered his laughter during difficult drills, his quiet encouragement when someone faltered, his ability to turn even the most stressful situation into something bearable. Without him, the training centre felt emptier, quieter, yet his influence remained. His methods, his advice, his very example continued to guide younger cosmonauts. Investigations into the crash began immediately, but answers proved elusive. Conflicting reports suggested different causes: sudden weather changes, a collision with another aircraft, or an evasive maneuver to avoid a balloon or bird strike. For years, the exact reason remained unclear, adding a layer of mystery to his death. What never faded, however, was his image. The young man with the wide smile, the steady gaze, the spirit that seemed unshakable. In a time when fear and rivalry defined much of global politics, Gagarin had been a reminder of something greater, that beyond borders, beyond ideologies, humanity shared one fragile planet and one boundless sky. His orbit of Earth had lasted just 108 minutes, yet its echo stretched across generations. In villages and cities alike, people looked upward and felt that the stars were closer because of him. His story became legend, passed from parents to children, teachers to students, reminding all who heard it that courage could turn dreams into reality. In the years following Yuri Gagarin's death, his legacy grew into something larger than a single life. He became a symbol not only of Soviet achievement, but of the universal human spirit. Statues of him began to rise across the Soviet Union, tall figures of metal with arms stretched upward, capturing the moment of ascent. Streets, schools, and factories were named in his honor. In Moscow, his likeness appeared on posters, postage stamps, and even in children's books where his story was told as a fairy tale of courage. For young Soviets, Gagarin was more than a historical figure. He was a role model, proof that greatness could come from the humblest beginnings. Teachers repeated his story endlessly. A boy from a poor village, whose family lived through occupation and hardship, who studied, persevered, and reached the stars. Parents encouraged their children to dream bigger because of him. Beyond the Soviet borders, his image carried equal weight. Nations across Europe erected monuments, universities held lectures in his memory, and even in countries far from the politics of the Cold War, his name was spoken with admiration. He had transcended the rivalry that had shaped his era. For many, he symbolized the possibility that space could unite rather than divide. Even in the United States, astronauts like John Glenn spoke of him with respect, remembering that, regardless of national competition, they all shared the same dangerous journey into the unknown. His image was also carefully preserved by the state. The Soviet government understood the power of myth, and Yuri's story became central to national identity. Official films portrayed him as fearless and pure, the perfect representative of socialism. Yet those who had known him personally recalled something more genuine. They spoke of his laughter, his curiosity, his kindness to children, his simple humanity that made him approachable to anyone. This tension between symbol and man only deepened the legend. Meanwhile, the space race pressed onward. New missions launched, longer flights were attempted, and dreams of the moon grew louder. But no matter how many milestones were reached, Gagarin's name remained the first. Every cosmonaut who strapped into a spacecraft did so knowing that he had opened the door. Every astronaut in the West, too, acknowledged that they followed a path he had marked. His legacy was not just the achievement of orbit, but the vision of Earth itself as fragile, unified, and beautiful. In the late 1960s and 1970s, as space programs expanded, his story continued to inspire. Children around the world gazed at the night sky and imagined themselves following in his footsteps. His flight had been short, his life tragically shorter, yet the resonance of his journey was timeless. For humanity, Yuri Gagarin remained the first messenger from beyond the sky, a reminder that one small step upward could lift the entire world. As the decades passed, Yuri Gagarin's legacy became woven into the very identity of space exploration. Every April 12th, the anniversary of his flight, was marked with ceremonies across the Soviet Union, later celebrated as Cosmonautics Day. Children in schools recited his name, veterans shared their memories, and newspapers retold the story of his journey into orbit. It became a ritual of remembrance, both solemn and uplifting, a reminder that humanity had once broken through the sky for the very first time. In towns and cities, busts of his smiling face appeared in public squares. His statue rose high in Moscow on Leninsky Prospect, gleaming metal arms stretched upward as if still ascending. For many who walked past it daily, it was not only a monument to one man but a symbol of aspiration itself, the belief that no dream was too distant. Beyond Russia, his memory continued to inspire. In countries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, lectures and exhibitions told of the day humanity first saw Earth from above. Scientists and astronauts who followed always acknowledged him. Neil Armstrong, standing on the moon in 1969, later said he admired Gagarin deeply, recognizing that without his courage the path might have been slower. In the United States, where Cold War competition had once made him a rival, he became remembered as a pioneer who belonged to all mankind. The image most often associated with him, the wide, open smile, remained timeless. It captured something universal: optimism, warmth, and the joy of discovery. People who never lived through his era still felt connected to that expression. In art, music, and literature, he appeared as a symbol of hope. Poets compared him to Icarus, but unlike the myth, he did not fall. He soared and returned, proving that humanity could fly beyond its limits. Within the cosmonaut corps, his memory was treated as sacred. New recruits were told his story in detail, encouraged to see themselves as continuing his mission. His personal qualities, discipline, humility, and kindness, were held up as the standard every cosmonaut should emulate. For them, he was not just a hero of the past, but a guiding presence still shaping their journey. His family preserved his legacy as well. Valentina remained devoted, ensuring his daughters grew up knowing not only the hero but the man behind the legend. She spoke of his humour, his tenderness at home, his love for simple moments, walking in the park, swimming with his children, or reading aloud in the evenings. These memories softened the image of the great pioneer, reminding people that even legends are built from ordinary joys. By the 1970s and 1980s, as humanity looked beyond Earth with space stations and interplanetary probes, Gagarin's name continued to be invoked. He was no longer simply the first cosmonaut. He had become a timeless figure, a reminder of where it all began, and proof that the human spirit could rise above fear and touch the infinite. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Yuri Gagarin's story remained alive in the imagination of generations who had never seen him in person. In classrooms across the Soviet Union, children learned his biography almost as a sacred text. Teachers described the boy from Klushino, who became the first man to see Earth from space, turning his life into both a lesson in perseverance and a symbol of patriotic pride. But even outside the Soviet Union, his name carried weight. In developing countries, where progress and modernity were often measured by achievements in science, Gagarin represented the possibility that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. His humble background made his story relatable. He was not born into privilege, yet he had carried humanity into the cosmos. This gave hope to millions that talent, effort, and courage could overcome barriers. At the same time, his image was carefully maintained by Soviet cultural institutions. Films, documentaries, and commemorative stamps ensured his memory never faded. Every April 12th was marked with parades, concerts, and lectures. Cosmonauts who followed him often spoke of how his example guided them in their darkest or most challenging moments. They felt that Yuri's spirit remained in every launch, a quiet reassurance that the path ahead could be crossed. In the wider world, Yuri's legacy entered art and literature. Writers described him as a figure who bridged earth and sky, a modern Odysseus who had voyaged into the unknown. Painters depicted his smiling face against the stars, while composers wrote music in his honour. Even in cultures far from Russia, the symbolism was powerful. He was not just Soviet, he was human, a reminder of what mankind could achieve when driven by wonder rather than fear. His story also shaped the new age of spaceflight. As stations like Salyut and later Mir orbited Earth, cosmonauts carried his memory with them. Photographs of Gagarin often hung inside modules, a silent guardian watching over crews. For them, he remained the first traveller, the one who had shown that the leap was possible. Internationally, as the Cold War softened and cooperation between East and West grew, Gagarin's image took on new meaning. In joint projects like Apollo-Soyuz in 1975, astronauts and cosmonauts together invoked his name as a shared foundation. They recognized that though nations had competed fiercely, the dream of space exploration transcended politics. For the Soviet people, especially during the turbulent years of late socialism, Gagarin's memory offered stability. Even as shortages grew and trust in leadership weakened, his story remained untarnished. He was pure, untouchable, a bright chapter that no failure could erase. Parents continue to tell their children about him, not only as a hero of space, but as proof that greatness was possible. His smile became almost mythical, a symbol of optimism in uncertain times. By the end of the 1980s, as the Soviet Union approached its final years, Yuri's image stood as one of the few unifying symbols that still carried genuine pride across the nation. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of its symbols lost meaning, but Yuri Gagarin's legacy endured. Amid the uncertainty of a new Russia, his story remained untouchable, remembered with the same reverence as before. For people facing economic struggle, political change, and the fading of old certainties, Gagarin was a reminder of pride, of a moment when their nation had led the world. Streets still bore his name, statues still stood in city squares, and his smile remained a familiar image in homes and schools. In 1991, April 12th was declared International Day of Human Spaceflight by the United Nations, ensuring that his achievement would never be confined to one country. It became a global celebration of humanity's first step beyond Earth, linking Gagarin's name forever with the shared heritage of mankind. In Russia, the tradition of honouring him deepened. Cosmonauts visiting orbiting stations carried his portrait, speaking his name during broadcasts. His memory became almost spiritual within the cosmonaut corps, where rookies were told that they walked the path first opened by him. Veterans often described how his courage set the standard by which all others were measured. Even in the modern space age, his story was retold to each new generation. In Western countries too, Gagarin's fame did not fade. Space agencies referred to him as the pioneer of human spaceflight. Documentaries revisited his life, highlighting not only the flight itself but his humble origins. For many, this detail, that he came from poverty, from a small village, and still reached the stars, was as inspiring as the flight itself. His name also began to appear in unexpected places, on cultural festivals, sports competitions, and even in songs that celebrated human courage. As the 1990s unfolded, Russia struggled with instability, yet Gagarin's image stood apart from politics. He belonged not to one government, but to all people. When foreign astronauts trained in Star City, they too learned his story, and many admitted to feeling humbled by it. To walk the same halls where Gagarin once studied, to sit in classrooms where his voice still seemed to echo, was to feel the weight of history. Families across Russia continued to tell their children about him. Parents described how he had been the first to see Earth from space, how he had returned smiling, carrying a vision of the planet as fragile and beautiful. In a world full of uncertainty, that vision remained steady. For many, it was proof that even when everything else changed, the dream of space, the dream Gagarin had lived, would always endure. By the late 1990s, as the International Space Station began to take shape, his legacy grew even stronger. It was no longer just Russia that claimed him. Humanity as a whole looked to Gagarin as its first representative in the stars. As the 21st century began, Yuri Gagarin's legacy found new life in a world transformed by technology and globalization. Space exploration had shifted from Cold War rivalry to international cooperation, and yet his story remained at the center. In 2001, 40 years after his flight, commemorations were held across Russia and abroad. In Moscow, thousands gathered near his towering statue on Leninsky Prospect, laying flowers, holding banners, and gazing upward as though following his path to the sky. At the same time, astronauts aboard the International Space Station paid tribute, speaking his name as they orbited the Earth he had once circled alone. For them, Gagarin was not a distant historical figure but a living presence, part of their journey. His smile, reproduced endlessly in photographs, appeared in classrooms, museums, and science centres worldwide. In schools, his story was used to inspire children to dream of science, engineering, and exploration. Teachers spoke of how he came from humble beginnings, reminding students that greatness often starts in the simplest of places. For many young people, the story of Gagarin was their first introduction to the idea that space was not unreachable, but part of humanity's shared future. In Russia, April 12th grew into a festival-like holiday. Known as Cosmonautics Day, it became a time of parades, concerts and lectures, where veterans of the program spoke of their experiences and reminded citizens of the nation's proud achievements. Later, UNESCO would recognise the same date as International Human Spaceflight Day, ensuring that Gagarin's legacy belonged to all humanity. Artists and writers of the new century also rediscovered him. Novels described him as a modern Prometheus who had carried fire into the heavens. Painters depicted him against cosmic backdrops, blending realism with myth. Filmmakers produced documentaries and dramas, exploring not only his flight but his humanity. The boy who grew up in hardship, the pilot who smiled even in danger, the father who cherished his family. Beyond culture, his name became embedded in science itself. Research institutes, spacecraft, and even craters on the moon were named in his honour. His image appeared on coins and banknotes, symbolising resilience and achievement. Internationally, astronauts from many nations paid tribute. American, European, Japanese and later Chinese spacefarers spoke of him as their inspiration. In interviews, many admitted that when they first dreamed of leaving Earth, it was Gagarin's story that sparked the vision. The universality of his appeal was striking. Though born of a specific time, a place and political struggle, his achievement transcended them all. By the 2010s, when humanity looked toward Mars and deeper space, his flight was still remembered as the first step on a journey that continued. In every launch, in every new milestone, the shadow of his small capsule and the sound of his cheerful voice, "Let's go," echoed across decades, reminding humanity of where it had begun. By the second decade of the 21st century, Yuri Gagarin had become not just a figure of history but an icon of global culture. His face appeared in murals on city walls from Moscow to London, from Buenos Aires to Bangalore. Artists used his image to speak of courage, of hope, of humanity's endless curiosity. His story was no longer tied only to the Soviet Union or Russia. It had become a narrative shared by all who looked to the stars. Every April 12th, celebrations expanded beyond Russia. In dozens of countries, events called Yuri's Night brought together space enthusiasts, scientists and ordinary dreamers. These gatherings mixed music, lectures and art, blending joy with reflection. People raised glasses not only to the first man in space, but to the spirit of exploration he represented. For many young people, who had grown up in an era where space travel felt routine, Yuri's story rekindled the wonder. They learned that before the International Space Station, before rovers rolled across Mars, there had been a moment when a single human broke the barrier for the very first time. His words, "Let's go," remain timeless, echoing across generations as a simple yet powerful call to adventure. In Russia, his memory was guarded with particular reverence. Gagarin's hometown of Gzhatsk had long ago been renamed Gagarin, and each year visitors came to walk the streets where he once lived, to see the modest house where he had grown up. Museums displayed his school notebooks, his pilot's uniform, even fragments of the Vostok capsule that had carried him around Earth. For visitors, the artifacts were more than relics. They were reminders that greatness could spring from the simplest origins. International astronauts continued to honour him. Many admitted that their decision to pursue spaceflight had been influenced by hearing his story as children. When they trained in Star City, they often felt a quiet sense of awe, knowing they walked in the halls he once walked. On the International Space Station, cosmonauts and astronauts marked April 12th with messages to Earth, speaking of unity and hope, always invoking Gagarin's name. His influence extended beyond space exploration. Human rights advocates, artists, and educators adopted his image as a metaphor for breaking barriers. For them, his flight symbolized not just leaving Earth, but overcoming fear, daring to step where no one had gone before. In this way, he became a symbol not only of space, but of human progress itself. Yet amid the legend, his humanity remained vital. People still remembered the carpenter's son, the boy who survived occupation during war, the man who loved his family and laughed with friends. That humanity kept his story real, preventing it from becoming only myth. By the late 2010s, as talk of Mars colonies and commercial flights filled the news, Gagarin's place in history remained secure. He was forever the first, the one who had opened the door, and though others had followed, his single orbit still stood as one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. As humanity entered the 2020s, Yuri Gagarin's legacy remained as bright as ever, perhaps even more luminous in an age when private companies and new nations joined the exploration of space. While rockets bearing unfamiliar logos lifted from launch pads, and astronauts from many countries shared life aboard the International Space Station, all of them still traced their path back to the morning of April 12, 1961. In speeches and interviews, leaders of space agencies across the globe invoked Gagarin's name. Elon Musk, speaking of future Mars colonization, mentioned him as a source of inspiration. European and Japanese astronauts spoke of reading his story as children. Chinese taikonauts, continuing their own program, referred to him as the first who showed the world it was possible. His legacy had become universal, a bridge across cultures and rivalries. In Russia, his presence was almost sacred. Cosmonauts preparing for launch at Baikonur touched his statue for luck, a ritual that had grown into tradition. Museums refreshed their exhibits, using digital displays and virtual reality to allow new generations to feel as though they sat inside Vostok 1, looking out through the same porthole that had once framed the curve of Earth. Schoolchildren still learned his biography, but now it was paired with stories of global cooperation, emphasizing that his achievement belonged to all of humanity. Internationally, Yuri's Night grew into a global festival. Each April, parties, lectures, and concerts were held in more than 50 countries. Some events were grand gatherings in city squares, others were small groups in homes and universities. Everywhere, the message was the same. Gagarin's flight was not just a triumph of technology, but a triumph of the human spirit. His story, told again and again, reminded people that exploration begins with courage. Scientists and philosophers reflected on the deeper meaning of his achievement. From space, Gagarin had described Earth as beautiful and fragile, and in an era facing climate change and global challenges, those words felt more urgent than ever. Leaders quoted him when speaking of the need to protect the planet, using his vision as both inspiration and warning. His image also thrived in art and culture. Street murals in Berlin and New York showed his face surrounded by stars. Musicians sampled recordings of his voice, blending Poya Kali into electronic tracks. Writers continued to weave him into novels, treating him as both man and myth, the one who had taken the first step into the infinite. Yet through all the celebration and symbolism, his humanity still shone through. People remembered the boy who built toys in a village, the young cadet who struggled with landings but never gave up, the man who reassured nervous colleagues with a smile. That smile, captured in countless photos, seemed eternal. For the modern world, where uncertainty often clouded the future, it was a reminder that optimism could be as powerful as rocket fuel. Yuri Gagarin's orbit had lasted only 108 minutes, but its echo had carried into a new century, shaping how humanity imagined its place among the stars. By the late 2020s, Yuri Gagarin's story still felt fresh, even though more than 6 decades had passed since his flight. Humanity had launched telescopes that peered deep into the universe, rovers that rolled across Mars, and probes that touched distant comets. Yet in every discussion of space exploration, his name inevitably appeared. He was the first, the one who had shown that the leap was possible. Scientists and astronauts continued to honour him not out of ritual but out of genuine respect. They knew that his courage had changed everything. Without Gagarin, the timeline of human spaceflight would have been slower, less certain, perhaps even broken by fear. His orbit had proven that the dream could be real. In Russia, his legacy was carefully preserved. Memorials were maintained, his hometown museum expanded, and new generations were brought to see the small house where he had been born. Standing there, among wooden walls and simple furniture, children often marvelled at how far he had travelled, not in miles, but in destiny. Teachers told them that Gagarin's greatness lay not only in his flight, but in his humility, in the fact that he never saw himself as more than an ordinary man doing his duty. Internationally, his reputation only grew. Nations with young space programs, India, the United Arab Emirates, Brazil, spoke of him as their inspiration. Astronauts from these countries often mentioned his smile, his words, and his bravery as reasons they had chosen to pursue space careers. In popular culture, he remained vibrant. His face appeared on T-shirts, in documentaries, and in virtual reality experiences that recreated his orbit. Writers described him as the first human storyteller of the stars, the one who returned from silence with a message of beauty. Even in an age when commercial flights began carrying tourists into low Earth orbit, people still looked back to that single moment in 1961 as the true beginning. His legacy also shaped philosophy. Thinkers reflected on his description of Earth as fragile and small. In an era when climate change and global challenges demanded attention, his words were quoted in parliaments and protests alike. The vision he carried down from orbit, that humanity shares one home, one planet, felt more urgent than ever. Yet perhaps the most enduring part of his story was the image itself. A young man, only 27 years old, smiling as he climbed into a capsule that would change history. That smile had carried through war, hardship, and risk, and it carried still into the hearts of those who dreamed of stars. Today, Yuri Gagarin's name belongs not only to history but to eternity. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, yet those minutes reshaped how humanity sees itself. Before him, the sky was a boundary. After him, it became a beginning. For Russians, he remains a national hero, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. For the world, he is the first traveller, the one who stepped into the unknown and returned with a vision that united more than it divided. His legacy continues in space stations orbiting Earth, in probes crossing the solar system, and in every new astronaut who straps into a rocket. Each one carries in some way his spirit. They often speak of feeling his presence, as though the path he opened still stretches before them. Cosmonauts touch his statue before launches. Astronauts quote his words as they prepare for missions. He's not a relic of the past, but a companion of the present, guiding humanity upward. His story is still told to children who look up at the night sky and imagine themselves following him. Teachers remind them that he was once just a boy in a village, building wooden toys, dreaming of the sky. That message, that greatness begins with small steps, remains as powerful as ever. In art, music, and literature, his image thrives. Writers describe him as a messenger between Earth and the cosmos. Musicians weave his voice into songs, and filmmakers retell his flight for new generations. His face, smiling, appears not as a warrior or conqueror, but as a friend, inviting all of humanity to share the journey. Philosophers and scientists alike return to his description of Earth as fragile, a blue sphere suspended in blackness. That vision, simple yet profound, has become part of humanity's collective consciousness. In a world often divided, it is a reminder of unity, of the need to protect the planet he first saw in its wholeness. Though Yuri Gagarin's life ended tragically young, his impact endures without limit. Time has only strengthened his place in memory. He was the first human to see Earth from space, the first to carry humanity's gaze beyond the sky, and his story remains both inspiration and compass. When people dream of Mars, of colonies among the stars, of journeys to distant worlds, They know that it all began with him. And so, when we look upward, past the clouds, past the atmosphere, into the vast night, we can still hear his cheerful call, simple, human, timeless. Let's go.